computer. And it's recording.
Everybody mind your P's and Q's.
Yeah, it'll be less bleeping out Craig will have to do later, I guess.
Yeah.
I'll behave.
Good. Welcome to Passport to Paddling, Kayaks and Gear. This is actually a three-part series, though they are all standalone parts that Craig and I had planned last fall to do some on-the-land instruction, stuff that when we're, actually doing paddling classes, this eats up a fair amount of time that could otherwise be spent on the water practicing some skills. It's all good to know information. Some of it's need to know. Tonight, we'll be going through this PowerPoint and at times probably switching the camera over and taking a look at some real gear or real boats. And this is, I think, the first program that we're streaming with the Wood County Park District due to the concerns that surround the outbreak of the coronavirus. This is something that we hope to do with some of our indoor programs that were more of a audience interaction based. They were teaching, but we want to hear from our audience, answer questions that they may have. So anytime you feel like unmuting yourself and asking a question, please feel free to do so. And then at the end, if you see something or didn't see something you wanted covered and want to ask a question, we should have some time at the end for some Q&A between Craig and myself. So we will get started. Tonight's focus is kayaks and gear. And, putting this PowerPoint together, didn't quite realize how ambitious it is. As far as kayaks go, there are kayak just about purpose built for every situation. But kayaks in general are very old technology. Native North Americans and Northern Europeans, Northern Asians have been using kayak-like boats for thousands of years. And they were built out of natural materials and used for mostly subsistence hunting and some traveling and exploration. So they developed that technology a long time ago. We've added modern materials to it, gotten a little bit more performance out of some things, but they still use traditional kayaks today to hunt traditionally in those cultures. So when you look at kayaks, there's a lot of considerations. Kayaks come in all shapes and sizes, and there's no one kayak that is going to handle every condition. It's sort of like the jack of all trades, master of none situation. You can get some very purpose-built kayaks that perform in limited situations, and you can get kayaks that are sort of general kayaks that perform adequately across a bunch of situations. And those are usually the kayaks that we here in Northwest Ohio purchase. We don't tend to drill down to very specific kayaks right off the bat. Most of us hop into either a recreation style boat or a touring type boat, a longer boat. But Northwest Ohio does have a lot of water types. So we are going to cover a few different types of boats tonight. We're also going to talk about some of the build criteria that lend itself to different waters. So we will move along. So what a kayak, its main purpose is to keep you out of the water, lets you float on the water. And the way people float and way things float on water is, whatever weight they are, they have to displace more weight in water than what they are. That's basically what displacement boils down to. And the factors in kayak design that influence displacement are on the screen. The length and width, the cross section of the hull, those give you your volume of your boat. And if your volume is greater then you float higher. If it's less, you float lower in the water. If it's too little, you sink. And then rocker and bow and stern shape have slightly different or slightly less influence on the total volume, but they also do affect it. So when we look at boats, we can sort of go with the Goldilocks breakdown, big, little, small, and look at boats in general to start getting an idea of the things that we're looking at as far as what different sizes and widths accomplish. Longer boats going to track a little bit better. It's going to have higher speed. It's going to be harder to turn. Small boats aren't going to track as well generally, but they're going to turn a lot easier. And then when you look at weight capacity, you're going to need a bigger boat. It's either going to have to be longer, or it's going to have to be wider. So when people get into kayaks, generally the first thing they notice is tippiness. And that when they first sit down, that's called initial stability. And if you want more initial stability, you usually have to go for a wider kayak. The trade-off is that wider kayaks are generally going to be slower in the same length as a narrower kayak with the same length. That makes sense. But that initial stability, while useful, is not always the most important factor on how a kayak behaves. Certain types of kayaks, yes. If you're a photographer or if you're an angler out fishing, you're not spending a lot of time paddling. When you stop, you want a stable platform. So in those situations, you do take the trade-off of being stable and at a full stop for the trade-off of lower speed and lower ease of paddling. But for people that are going from point A to point B, doing a trip, even if you're circling back around to point A, the secondary stability probably has a bigger impact on long-term enjoyment. So initial stability, while nice, is not everything. Granted, you do have to be initially stable enough to get in your boat and start paddling. So if it's too tippy to get in and get moving, then that boat's probably not for you. So when we look at boats, one of the first things we look at is hull shape. And the hull is the part of the boat under the water. And they come in 4 broad categories. Anytime we're talking about kayaks tonight with categories or divisions, there's a lot of bleed over from one shape or one category to another. These are not cut and dried. There's 10,000 hull shapes out there, none of them identical. But the main ones are rounded, V-shaped, flat, and pontoon. And what Craig and I generally use at the parks are sort of a hybrid. They have sort of a V shape at the front, then rounded sides, and then under the seat they're pretty flat. And that's pretty common across the market. The mid-level market of kayaks. You're going to have a hull that incorporates a few of these shapes. If we look at shapes, on the top of the screen, we have this chart, this line chart, and then over to the left of the chart, we have different hull shapes. The black line is V bottom, the green line's a flat bottom, blue is a flat bottom with a flare, and then you have slightly rounded, and purple and a round and red. And what it's showing on the chart is stability. And I would like to see the whole chart, so I'm going to move people over here. You can think of the degree of heel as being from the center line of the boat and how far off of vertical it gets. So when a boat moves here, left or right, we're measuring those degrees. So, 10 degrees, 20 degrees, 30 degrees, 45, and so on and so forth. Most boats initially, oh, and on the left axis, I'm sorry, is how much the boat resists rolling, any further over. Um, when you get to the peak of any of these curves, any further effort on the part of the paddler to lean over is going to have a very big impact on the boat going completely over. So the first part of the curve to the peak is how much the boat is fighting you to turn it further, to flip it on its side more. After the peak, that's how much effort the boat's putting in continuing to fight you. And you can see it rapidly goes down with some of these hull designs. Most people that get into a round boat find it very tippy to start with, but that round shape actually provides the most stability when you're leaning left or right, the degree of heel. And the picture at the bottom sort of shows why. So on the left, that is a flat bottom boat, and being that it has so much flat, so wide, that when a wave lifts it, the whole boat tilts. And if you look at the flat bottom, or the box boat on the graph, you can see that once it reaches 20 degrees, the boat's not fighting you so hard. It rapidly approaches zero. And the 0 point on the graph, the box boat hits zero about 40 degrees. That's when you're going to tip over, unless you throw in a bracing stroke, which is a slightly advanced stroke. So the peak of this chart and where the lines cross the zero line and go negative, those are the two big things on this chart. Once you cross zero, it's on you to tilt your boat back so that your head stays out of the water. So it's sort of I struggled to explain it, but basically, the hull shape determines how far over you can lean a boat, and at what point that boat reaches sort of the point of no return on its own. So there's not a bad hull shape on this graph. It's just you have to know the limitations of your boat. And that's true with a lot of kayaking gear and even your skills and knowledge. You need to know your limit.
And if I might, Bill, this is very much like a personal taste thing too. So all this is really important to know when you're going into, say, purchasing a boat, or maybe even using a friend's boat or something like that, to kind of expect what it's going to perform like. But each boat is very personal. The kayak is the boat that you wear, and you wouldn't wear a pair of pants that doesn't fit you. So you need to try on those pants. If you're going to a kayak store or something like that, make sure before you purchase that you have time in a boat that at least has the same hull shape. The best, obviously, would be if they had a pond nearby and you could ask to try it out. If they refuse, then maybe you shouldn't buy a kayak from them. But again, a kayak is a very personal thing. Obviously, we can grow in our skill and our flexibility, how our body adapts to using the boat. But it's really important that you have comfort with that boat before you actually go on any real water with it.
Yeah, very true. And, where this little graph came from is a manufacturer of some high-end boats, and, they paid to have this, computer modeling done of hull designs. And one of their big things that they're really saying is, if you look at the very beginning of the curve, from 0 degrees and zero force, notice that the slope of the curve of all the boats is very similar to 10 degrees. So if you can get in that kayak, reasonably well, keeping yourself balanced, they all have very similar initial stability. at least graph wise. When you start leaning them over, then you really start noticing differences. And 10 degrees is a fair amount of lean. When you get to 30 degrees, most beginners are not comfortable, and I've been there. Learning bracing strokes. You lean your boat over, and you basically are counting on the paddle stroke to keep you upright. So, give a boat a try, just like Craig said, and if you can paddle with it for a half hour or hour. While being prepared to get wet, find the limit of that boat, see if it's within your comfort. At the end of the hour, you'll be way more comfortable in that boat than the first minute you got in it. That's true for any boat. You got to get a feel for it. So the hull shape, the length, the width, those are probably the three biggest factors on feel of boat, capacity of boat, and things like that. We start getting into these remaining factors, and they have an influence. It's not a huge influence. If you were in two boats that were the same width and same length, and they just had a difference between these next characteristics, you could probably feel it at some point. It probably wouldn't be an immediate feeling. So these are things that you sort of look for going forward. If you're shopping for a brand new boat, these are things that you want to keep track of when you're trying out other boats. If you're trying your buddy's boat or if you're trying the park's boat, I think, Craig, we have 4 different models of boat, kayak.
1, 2, 3, 4. Yeah, 4 different distinct hull shapes anyway.
Yeah. So, and I know with this characteristic chine, I know we have for sure the multiple chine. We have one that is getting pretty close to a round bottom. It might be a soft chine deep V or round bottom or somewhere in between there. And you start leaning these boats over, you can start to feel the differences. Personally, my boat that I have is a multi-chine boat, and I like it. I've used the park boats. I've used the one that's close to a round bottom, and it's not tippy. It's just not. It doesn't really settle into a spot. But that's one of my preferences. I like that my personal boat settles into a spot, and I don't have to think about it much. I think Craig likes. I'm talking about those blue Luskas, I think. Lookshaws.
Yeah.
Craig likes them a little bit dancy because they turn easier. So.
There are some pros and cons with the chines for sure. Like you were saying, where that comes into play is does that secondary stability, does it kind of have a wall? You could almost sort of compare it to like a compound bow. Like after it has that let off, there's a valley, there's a wall, and then there's like the hill or I'm sorry, I'm just coming up with this right now, but different chines will behave differently, especially in the secondary stability when it starts to roll, or how it deals with waves or not totally flat water.
Yeah. So what it says on the screen is pretty simple as far as what it does. If you lean to turn, which is sort of a intermediate skill to have, especially on big water, it's real nice. You don't have to throw in steering strokes while you're going. You can just lean your boat and you'll make a gentle turn. Hard chines make that a little easier. Soft chines make it a little more difficult. The trade-off is hard chines on big water, the waves can exert more force than the soft ones. They basically have more of a flat surface to push. So, a factor that is not talked about much, actually I found this source from a Canadian kayaking instruction course is flare. The flare is what the sides do between the water line and the deck or the gunnel, depending on what kind of kayak you have. Um, a little bit of flare can be nice. It adds a little bit of secondary stability, and that secondary stability is basically when your kayak leans left or right, either into the water or into a wave. Secondary stability is the kayak's ability to move into that water. And when it does that, what it does for you is basically allows you to not have to lean your body over as far to correct for your center of gravity being shifted. We have a little slide at the end of this that might explain that a little bit better. And then the tumble home, that's sort of stolen from a canoe design. And basically, by cutting that angle on the top, it makes it easier for you to paddle. Your hand is less likely to run into the deck. So most kayaks, most sit-inside kayaks sort of have that tumble home built into it. As far as like the roto-molded plastic boats, some of the Kevlar or fiberglass boats do have a flat side and flattish deck, but they're also lower profile boats, so your hands aren't as close to hitting them as a larger plastic boat. All right. Rocker is how much does your boat look like a banana? Or does it look more like a carrot? Rocker changes how well your boat tracks through the water. How well does it stay going straight? More rocker makes your boat easier to turn, but it's also harder to keep it going straight. In certain designs, adding rocker can make the boat a little bit quicker by changing the wetted area of the boat, basically. Water against a boat surface creates friction. So if you can change how much friction there is, you can increase or decrease efficiency. So we don't see a lot of rocker on touring boats. We don't see much on the recreational kayaks, the shorter kayaks with their, for slower water. Where you see the most rocker is in whitewater boats, basically where you want to be able to turn your boat very easily to aim for the next element in the rapids. So rocker is really important to fast water boats, specifically whitewater. And then hulls come in two basic flavors: planing hulls versus displacement hulls. Planing hulls are designed to skim over the water once you attain a certain speed. They reduce friction in that way, but steering is not as, how can I put it? Steering is not as easy, or it's too easy, depending on how you look at it. If you want to go in a straight line in a planing hull, it's a little bit more difficult because each paddle stroke you make is going to make the boat turn. Whereas in a displacement hull, it's designed to plow through the water, pushing it out of the way, displacing it. And when you do that, the water pushes back. It pushes against the hull from both sides and the bottom, and you basically create sort of a trench or a rail that you're riding with your boat. So it will follow that rail pretty well. When you're breezing across the top of the water in a planing hull, it's very easy to change direction because you're not cutting into the water, you're just skimming across it. So we don't see a lot of planing hulls outside of whitewater. Some of the whitewater hulls are designed so well that you can sit facing upstream on the front side of a wave, a stationary wave, And you can sit there for minutes at a time with very few paddle strokes because the water just skims right underneath of you. Other factors. So when you look at designs of boats, the heavier the boat is itself, the more stable it's going to feel, because stability really centers around center of gravity, and that's the center of gravity of you. Um, and sort of the buoyancy point, um, the area underwater that corresponds to that center of gravity when everything's vertical. Um, Heavier boats bring the center of gravity lower, closer to the water surface or underneath the surface of the water. Those are very stable places. Lighter boats, the center of gravity can be higher depending on other factors. If you have stuff sitting on the deck of your boat, if you are a top heavy person like I am, um, the center of gravity goes up. And when it goes up, it's easier for that center of gravity to move left or right of the buoyancy point, or the buoyancy point, center of gravity. Um, there are ways around it. There are manufacturers that make weights that go into kayaks, usually the longer boats, that help bring the center of gravity lower. It makes the boat less tippy. You are adding weight. You can also add weight in the bottom of your boat. Throw a gallon of water in there, or something right in the bottom, and that brings it a little bit lower as well. And then, going forward, when we start looking at different types of boats, center of gravity is related to the boat, and it's related to you and your gear. The higher your seat is, the higher your center of gravity is. So being as low into the water as you can be gives you the most stability. So the people in that boat are not going to be super stable because they have a lot of stuff above the surface of the water. Although that boat's sunk in there, they don't have much freeboard on the side. No margin of error there. So, talked about this just a few minutes ago. All of these factors feed into how much of this you need to do and how much you can do. When you're in a kayak, just like Craig said, you're wearing the boat. It's a part of you. You're a part of it. You sort of lock into the boat using your feet, your thighs, and your butt. And then right above your butt is your hips. And how much or how willing you are to move your hips and maintain a upright profile to the water surface or the center of gravity is going to affect how well you can kayak and what kind of kayak you'll feel comfortable in. If you have nice loose hips and can rock side to side, you can definitely feel a little bit more comfortable in a boat that has lower initial stability. It feels like a more tippy boat, but if you have loose hips, that's not a problem. The benefit of that is when you do have a boat that's a little bit more tippy, it's also easier to correct a tip. By working with it, you can bring that boat back onto a level plane easier than a boat that potentially is very resistant to tipping. So if there's one thing that you should practice anytime you're out in a kayak, it's practicing rocking your hips up and down, left to right, up and down, and getting comfortable with the boat tilting underneath of you. Basically, that big blue rectangle that's at the bottom of the picture, make your boat do that, tip it, and then maintain your center of gravity over your tailbone. Keep your head above your tailbone. And that's one of the biggest tips and tricks I could give you to staying in your boat and not flipping your boat over. See what Craig thinks about that.
I was going to say, really the best visual I can give is, let's say that all you've ever done is sit in a lazy boy recliner your whole life, not one that is a rocker or glider or anything. You sit down in the lazy boy and boom, you're there, you're solid. It's comfortable, it's great, but if you put enough pressure on that lazy boy one way or another, you're not coming back. The thing's tipping over. So you can equate a lazy boy to a boat that has a very flat bottom, without much rocker and without much chine. Now let's say that all you've ever known is lazy boys, and suddenly somebody asks you to, hey, why don't you try and sit in this rocking chair? And you sit in a rocking chair, and the first thing you do is what? You're going to rock back and you go, whoa, what the heck was that? But if you've sat in that rocking chair for long enough, you know what to expect. You know its limitations. You know how far it goes front and back. And if a force is enacted and it pushes you backward a little bit, what's that rocking chair going to do? It's going to rock back, but you have the capability to bring it back forward. Now, obviously, it has its limitations too. You can push it too far, and it eventually is going to tip. But the more that you sit in these chairs, the more that you sit in different boats, the more you'll be able to expect performance out of them.
I'd say that's a good analogy right there. All right. So when you're looking at boats, there are factors that affect how well you can use a boat, or if you can use it at all. When we're talking about boats that have a top deck, they're enclosed, there's something going, there's a part of the boat that's over your legs. It doesn't matter if it's only the feet or reaches up to the knee, or if it reaches all the way up to like mid-thigh. That's the deck part of the boat. And deck height can be really crucial. People with big feet need a tall deck. Cockpit size and type, there's a bunch of different varieties there. Generally, people start out with the biggest cockpit that they can get into because it's the most comfortable and least claustrophobic, and then they move on from there. And then we'll look at seat design as well. So kayak volume-wise, this relates to how big of a person you are. I'm 6 foot tall and 240 pounds. I'm not getting into a boat that's built for a person who is 5'4" and 115 pounds. That's just not going to happen. And conversely, that person that's 5'4" and 115 pounds is going to be swimming in the boat that I use. So kayaks they're not interchangeable between people. They generally are built to certain size ranges. And by testing out boats, you can start to figure out, what dimensions you need, what types of volume, high volume, medium volume, low volume boat you would want. But don't forget about cargo. Myself and 3 others just made a trip down the Maumee River last May. We did the whole length of it, and we carried all of our supplies that we needed for the trip. And 2 of us were in boats that had loads of cargo room, plenty of room. And the other 2 had boats that held about half as much cargo as our boats. And we had enough room that everyone could carry their own gear. The 2 boats that could carry more gear carried a lot of the shared gear. But I would say that just about anybody could have gotten away with that 4-day trip with each boat that they used. But there are boats that have almost no storage space to carry things for long trips, types of boats that don't have that. And the reason to not get the biggest boat you can get is sort of twofold. One, it's going to be a heavier boat and you're pushing that weight by yourself, with your paddles. 2, you might not fit inside of it very well. And there are ways around that. You can wedge in foam to make a tighter fit so that you can lock into that boat and get the most out of it. And then 3, the wind. You can see in this picture, the blue boat is much shorter than the red boat. And if you're a light person sitting in that red boat, there's a lot of that boat sticking out of the water. And that area out of the water will be affected by wind. And if there's too much wind, there's too much area, you might not be able to turn that boat, or you might not be able to paddle into the wind with that boat. it could stop you in your tracks and you're stuck going with the wind or to the side, tacking away to the wind. Whereas if you had a correct size boat, that wouldn't be an issue, or it'd be less of an issue. So what you want to look for is, the minimum you can get away with, and feel good. Always factor in the weight of your gear or potential gear you're going to take, because it's not insignificant. If you take, a fair amount of safety gear and water, food, or camping equipment, that those pounds add up quick. So when we look at cockpits, the most open ones are the sit-on tops, which is that green and white boat right there. It's a tandem kayak. They have no deck. You're completely exposed to the elements. That can be a good thing. That can be a bad thing. If you don't mind getting wet, those boats are fine. If you remember your sunblock, those boats are also fine. If you don't like getting sunburnt and you don't like remembering sunblock, it's probably not the boat for you. Right below it is sort of beginner's recreational kayak. Basically, the only thing covered up there might be your ankles and knees. Knees by the side of the boat, ankles and feet underneath that deck at the very front. The rest of you is going to be exposed to the sun, but you are sitting a little bit lower. You're a little bit more closed in. You won't have as much of your body affected by the wind, and you'll be a little bit drier. And then when you look at the top right, that's a pretty typical cockpit for a touring boat. That's a Necky, which we have a few of at Wood County Parks. And that's a enclosed cockpit. It's going to cover you to about the mid-thigh. It keeps you the driest. It also can be the warmest. If it's a hot day, inside under that deck is going to get pretty warm and humid. But it also has the easiest ability to seal off around the cockpit. They make devices called spray skirts that seal to your body and then seal to the deck, and they basically keep all the water out. A lot easier to get spray skirts for touring boats than it is for the really big recreational cockpits. And then the bottom right are a series of fiberglass boats and different cockpit shapes. Standard keyhole is pretty common. Ocean cockpit's probably the smallest. It requires you to be the most limber to get in and out of. And then open's probably the biggest you'll see on a fiberglass boat. All of those fit like a glove, basically like a surgical glove. So you have to know how to enter and exit those boats. Once you do, they are very responsive to your body movements. They are fully engaged with your hips, your thighs, and your knees and your feet. I have not tried out any of the smaller ones. I've made it to the touring boat size and am plenty comfortable with that. Someday, moving towards a standard keyhole or a keyhole compromise, definitely I'd love to paddle a boat on Lake Erie that has a cockpit like that and is that responsive. Craig may have some experience with those cockpits.
Not really.
Oh, I thought you'd tried a few out.
No. I've looked at some that have kind of the ocean cockpit, and even smaller actually, where they're so small and round, you get in them and you are not designed to pop out of that boat in the water. You must have a role in your skill set. So a lot of these cockpit shapes and sizes, some of them require some skill along with them to use them appropriately and safely. So really, this is just sort of to get you exposed to the different shapes. And if you're in the market for a boat and you're like, where I want to go straight out to the ocean, that's fine. But keep in mind that you are going to need you're going to need equipped with a certain amount of skill, time for practice, and also gear. But I don't want to tap into that too much. That's in a section coming up.
Yeah. Yeah, and Craig's got a good point. You can spend all the money on that you want on gear, but when you do that, you probably need to spend some money or at least time on the skills required to use that gear. Because you can buy gear that's way more capable than you are. It's very easy to do in kayaking, uh, either through ignorance or um, you know it can perform things or do things or require you to perform things that you don't know about. You can get into a little bit of trouble that way. Seats, everyone likes a comfortable seat. And seats can be, when you start talking to kayakers, experienced kayakers, they're going to have very definitive ideas on seats. Um, what I can tell you is I like a comfortable seat. Um, and I am willing to sacrifice a little bit of performance to have that comfort. If we look at the slide, that Hobie boat, the orange boat, that has a suspension seat. It's very comfortable, but it's also very high. And we've already talked about center of gravity. The higher you are in a boat, sort of the easier it is to move the center of gravity or tilt the boat, fall off the boat very quickly. Um, the lower your seat is in the water, the more stable in general your boat's going to be. So that's a high seat. That's also a very wide boat. It's probably a boat that's 32 to 34 inches wide, whereas most of our touring kayaks are in the order of 24 to 28 inches wide. So
It
we're
looks
talking
like a
about,
stand-up paddleboard.
it does, but it is a kayak.
Huh.
It's a weird one. It's pedal drive.
Oh.
Oh, you still got to steer with a paddle though. But the boat in the top right corner is a sit on top. That's the next lowest. It's not quite as high as that Hobie with the suspension seat. Um, the nice thing about the seat that you're looking at there is it very easily folds down. Meaning if you need to turn around and get something, you could scoot and flip it down and reach it. Or if you're re-entering your kayak from deep water, you can slide right over it. It should collapse down, and then when you get past it, it'll pop right back up. Um, stand up or sit on top kayaks are somewhat difficult to re-enter in deep water. We're going to talk about that in a little bit. The lower left boat has sort of the common seat design that we see in the mid-level kayaks, the touring boats, and the higher end recreation boats, anywhere from $600 to $1,500 boats. It's got a lot of adjustment to it. That seat back can be moved up or down. It can be moved forward, towards the bow, or leaned back towards the stern. And then the seat pan itself is pretty well padded and also adjustable. The seat pan can be raised up or lowered down to provide support for your thighs, which by supporting your thighs, you can eliminate a little bit of that feet going to sleep feeling after, from sitting in your boat. And then the middle center is a very low profile design, minimal seat pan, and the back support is basically just sort of attached in there. They're pads that are attached to the side of the boat, but you can see they don't stick above the cockpit edge at all. Makes that boat very easy to enter. Nothing is getting in your way if you're sliding over that back deck trying to get your feet back in there. Also, you have the ability to lean back flat against your back deck during a roll. Some of the rolls make you lean back, some of them make you lean a little bit forward. That seat back on that middle bottom is not going to impede you in any way during a roll. And then the commercial version of that is what's in the lower right, and that's a back band. And most people with higher performing boats go with back bands. They prefer them. They basically set them to give themselves a little bit of lower back support, but not much at all. They rely on their posture to keep them straight, which is the preferred way to paddle, is upright, basically nose over tailbone. I personally don't like back bands much, but I do have lower back issues, so I like a little bit more support, like what the seat in the lower left provides. But I also don't try to roll my kayak. If I flip over or fall out, I'll be riding that kayak and draining it and then getting back in a different way. What do you think, Craig?
I love my back band. But I guess I'm blessed in the fact that I'm able to keep myself very upright. And like Bill said, proper paddling is staying active in the core and on up. So actually, a lot of the most highest end boats, when you're talking, some of these British brands, they don't even come with seats because the seat is so personal to you. So they actually require people to form their own seats. And a lot of these highest end, most expensive boats, you'll look inside the cockpit and it's just some chiseled out piece of foam. But that, again, the person buying that boat knew that that's what it was. They know how to form their seat to their hiney. And they also need to make sure that they have that hip padding in that bottom middle picture. You can see that one actually has some hip padding so that your tuchus isn't sliding to the left or to the right, and it is as responsive as possible. So again, another very personal thing. It's all up to you, really.
Yep. All right. Up until this point, we've not talked exclusively or specifically about types of kayaks. There's all ways to divide it out. This is one of the simpler ways. You have your sea and touring kayaks. Those are your longer, skinnier ones. Pretty high volume, usually smaller cockpits. They're faster, but they're harder to turn. Sit-on tops can be for fishing. They can just be for recreation as well. Those are probably the warmest weather boats, in my opinion, because you're going to get wet and you are exposed to the elements. And then sit inside. Those are our recreation kayaks. It says fishing at the bottom, and you can certainly fish out of those. But they are also probably the most common kayak on the Maumee River. And then the freestyle whitewater boats generally are going to be some of your shortest boats, and they are very purpose-built. As far as kayaks go, they're some of the most purpose-built kayaks that are out there, because the environment that they operate in is very dynamic, very fast-changing, in a very quick water environment as well. So what kind do you want or what kind do you need? I mean, it depends on what you're going to do. If you're going to be out on Lake Erie, sea or touring kayak is a good choice as long as you're familiar with it and have the skill set to use it. Sit inside fishing boats can be okay as well, and so can the sit on top fishing boats. But with both of those, you have to be aware of conditions, and conditions play a huge role in being able to safely paddle. And people with two different skill sets looking at the same weather, that weather might be hazardous, or those water conditions might be hazardous to one and not hazardous to another. I know there's a dozen or half dozen people in Northwest Ohio that are already kayaking right now. They have the gear and they have the skill sets to go and kayak in 45-degree water. I don't have that skill set or that gear. So when you're looking at it, we have a big body of water. We have Lake Erie that acts like an ocean, but in some ways is a little bit more dangerous than the ocean. The waves in Lake Erie are much steeper to their sides than ocean swells are, or even ocean waves. The height of our waves don't tend to get ocean height, You know, when you think of big waves in the ocean, you know, routinely 5 to 7 feet, you know, that's not common on Lake Erie. But the distance between the waves that we have in our lake is smaller. And like I said, the sides are steeper. So trying to ride over those waves is more difficult than an ocean wave. Um, you know, we have ponds, we have small lakes, we have the Maumee River, which in certain sections is whitewater. In certain sections, it's basically a slow moving pond. And then you have in between, you have, you know, moving water, noticeably moving water, um, but it's, you know, pretty wide and flat. So trying to find a boat that does all of those things, you know, it's not really possible. You know, most people in Northwest Ohio, if they want to paddle different waters, they're going to have more than one boat, you know, because they'll get more enjoyment when they have a boat that's more specific built for what they're doing. So when you go looking for a boat, you need to have in mind what water and what you want to do on the water. You know, if you want to take week-long trips, you know, you're going to be going with a touring boat or a sea kayak, so you have that cargo room. So this picture just sort of shows a whole breadth of variety. Unfortunate thing with this picture is they, you know, put it all together with a bunch of different pictures and they made all the boats the same length, and they are not. Those two boats on the far left are probably 10-foot boats. And then, let's see, the boat that is orange with two black hatches, you know, a top round hatch and a bottom black oval hatch, that's probably a 14 or 15-foot boat there. So best picture I could find to show differences in boats, but it's not a perfect picture because those are all different lengths. And here we go with charts. And I know people like charts, they like simple answers, but for people that are just getting into it, they don't know enough to know what's not great about charts. And what's not great about charts is charts don't really take into consideration skill level or experience. They don't take into, you know, local conditions, and you know, they don't even, you know, boats inside of each category can be pretty different throughout the category. So trying to label boats as far as, you know, what they're capable of doing in this kind of detail is sort of garbage. Um, you know, if I'm looking at, you know, the lakes category in the first blue box, and says sit on top recreation boat is best for lakes, um, and sit inside rec is best. Um, you know, that people see Lake Erie and they're like, that's a lake. I'll take those boats out on the Lake Erie. And that's not a good choice.
Yeah, this is a garbage chart.
Yeah, this is a garbage chart basically. And the sad thing is, you know, I found this chart in two different websites in two different forms. You know, one cut off that kayak hybrid on the end. But, you know, one of them was the American Kayak Association had this chart on their website.
Oh no.
Yeah, and they're based out of Columbus. So,
Well, come on.
yeah.
Nothing like a boating chart coming from a landlocked state. Oh,
No,
that's not
Columbus.
true. Duh, we have the lake.
Yeah, we have Lake Erie. So, excuse me,
Landlocked city then.
landlocked city. So anytime you see a chart as far as kayak stuff, you know, it could be boat, could be paddles, um, you know, a few other parts that go along with kayaking. Uh, take it with a grain of salt. You know, talk to an expert. You know, talk to a boat dealer. Call me or Craig or shoot us an email. You know, we always have an opinion. Um, we're always willing to say, well, I don't know. You're going to have to ask someone else. I'm not just going to BS you an answer. Uh, but charts like this are not great. You know, if I had more time to go through, and we could talk about all kinds of examples that don't line up with this that are found locally. So just beware. When you do go out looking for a boat, You know, if you're looking on a website, you're gonna find a bunch of parts that are labeled. Uh, the three that I've circled are the three that I would consider very important. Um, and not all boats will come with these things, but there are ways to mitigate it or add them back into just about any boat. Perimeter safety lines are probably the number one uh, thing to have if you're going to be paddling in water that is deeper than you can stand in and get back in your boat. Basically, if it's what's considered deep water, which is, basically 4 to 5 feet. If the water is deeper than 4 to 5 feet and you fall out, you're it's going to be very difficult to get back in without using some perimeter safety line. They're handholds. It's a static rope. It doesn't stretch, and you get your hand under it and you can use it to climb back into your boat. And then the rubber hatches themselves are not what's important. It's what they potentially signify. When you see hatches on boats, typically for stern hatches, the left side of that boat where there's an oval and a circle, um, in between that circle and the seat, there's going to be what's called a bulkhead. That's basically a watertight wall that seals off that compartment from the cockpit. When you have a watertight wall behind you, you pretty much guarantee if those hatches are in place that your boat's not going to sink because it's going to have a huge air pocket stuck into it. If you add a bulkhead in front of your feet where the single round hatch is on the right, now you have an airtight compartment in front of you and behind you. You could fill that entire cockpit with water. And chances are the edge of that cockpit, the coaming, is going to be an inch, inch and a half above the water surface, which allows you in calm water to actually bail out your boat. So you can empty your boat without leaving it and then be on your way again. So bulkheads are one of the biggest safety things on boats, especially on deep water. If you have a boat that has no bulkheads, they're extremely difficult to empty out, even with the assistance of another kayaker. Um, it is doable. There are certain techniques to drain a non-bulkheaded boat. It's not fast, and it's very difficult. With at least one bulkhead, it gets a lot easier. And like I said, there's ways around this. You can add perimeter line. They make kits that you can buy and install yourself. They make bulkheading kits. It's basically closed cell foam that you caulk into place after you cut it to shape. And you can create your own airtight compartments. Putting in a bulkhead is not scary. Uh, if you don't have a hatch there, when you go to cut into your boat, that's the scary thing. And I have a two-person sit inside kayak that I use with my daughter that I want to add a rear hatch to. And that's the scary part. When you cut a hole into a boat, you better be able to, seal that hole back up. So that'll be a project that I'll be trying this spring. What do you think, Craig?
Um, Forgive me if you already said it, but this can be a really sneaky, confusing thing too. A lot of recreation boats that you're going to buy at Menards or Kmart or whatever, they
Yes.
will have rubber hatches at the back. And you'll
Yeah.
think, oh, this seems like a really nice place to put my stuff. That'll keep it nice and dry. But most of those cheap boats, if you look underneath of the seat, you look behind the seat, it is open.
Yeah.
And some boats do it. Some manufacturers do it really sneaky, where it'll seem like there's a bulkhead there that's that's molded in. It's plastic, but look underneath the seat. The seat is suspended, and the water can go whoop right back in there and fill your boat just the same. So make sure that there's an actual bulkhead back there, and you can see where every edge hits the outside hull of the boat.
Yeah. The easiest way to test for it is take a pebble, a rock or a bolt or something, drop it into the hatch, and then lift up the boat from, the end away from the hatch and see if it rolls to the other end of the boat. And if it rolls all the way to the front of the boat, guess what? You don't have a bulkhead. So, or you can just stick your head in the hatch and look towards the center of the boat and see if there's a foam wall there or not. But yeah, a lot of the inexpensive boats that have hatches don't, in fact, have bulkheads. So they will also fill completely with water. So now that we covered that, we're going to get into the types of boats that are out there. And we're going to start with the touring and sea kayaks. There's not a huge difference between the two names. Touring boats are generally thought of as a little bit smaller, able to carry a little less cargo, and sea kayaks tend to be a little bit longer and potentially can carry a little bit more cargo. Sea kayaks also tend to be a little bit more on the high performance end. You know, if you go see this beautiful Kevlar or fiberglass kayak that's 17 feet long, if you call that a touring boat, they might get upset with you. They're going to call it a sea kayak most of the time. So they are longer, they are narrower. They go anywhere from 12 feet up to 21 feet. I've heard of some 23 feet sea kayaks that are paddled by a single paddler. The typical range is going to be 12 to I think 18 or 19. And when you look at them in their plastic forms, they're going to be between $800 and $1,200. And that's just for the high quality plastic models. When you start getting into fiberglass and Kevlar, the sky's the limit. There's $5,000 kayaks out there on Lake Erie every summer. So just know that it can be an expensive proposition to get boats, and boats that you'll like using. They are very quick boats, usually considered the fastest of the boats as far as under human propulsion. A whitewater boat might go faster, but it's because the water's pushing it. And then a lot of them use either rudder or skeg. We're going to talk about that in the next slide. They are a little unwieldy to transport and store and just generally carry. They generally should be handled by two people when they're on land to make it easier. So always a good idea when you're paddling to paddle with a buddy anyways. It's a pretty big safety rule that we'll talk about in another session. Let's see. And then, we talked about watertight compartments. These boats, almost all of them will have two. Some of them have three. That top boat, that front hatch, little cookie hatch or snack hatch, that's probably its own compartment. It's also watertight. So that one probably has three. That necky down low has two. So when we say skeg or rudder, this is what we're looking at. Skegs are built into the boat. They reside in a skeg box that's actually part of the hull. That skeg is down, and when it's not down, when it's retracted, it would disappear inside of the boat. Wouldn't be influenced by the water at all. Skegs are very nice to help you track straight, especially when there's a wind blowing you. Wind acts on boats very easily, mostly by pushing the back of the boat and turning you. So you usually turn into the wind, and a skeg can help overcome that. The rudder down below is something that's steered with your feet, and also can steer the boat. It can turn your boat left and right. It can also be used to a certain extent to act like a skeg. You can set it at a certain angle to help counteract the wind. If you are not proficient or well developed in your stroke form, if you're using one of these to help you go straight in calm conditions, just know that you're wasting energy by doing so, because if you're using that to keep you going straight in calm conditions, it's basically pushing up against the water, which is robbing some of the energy you're putting into your stroke. It's keeping you from going sideways at the cost of energy. Skegs and rudders are in some circles becoming more debatable. The really sort of pro kayakers, they don't like rudders because in rescue situations, rudders are a hazard to the person being rescued sometimes, and sometimes to the rescuer. Skegs can jam. They can get jammed inside the hull if there's gravel or dirt or mud that pack up into where the skeg sits. It can keep the skeg from being deployed. Basically, these are mechanical devices that can fail. They should not be a replacement for a proficient paddling stroke. You know, being able to paddle straight shouldn't rely upon a skeg or a rudder in calm conditions. So a lot of the higher end recreational boats and just about all the touring plastic boats, you can get rudder kits for those. Uh, the other drawback that rudders have is that they take a little bit of control away, because your feet can shift, and your feet are supposed to be an anchor point in your boat. They're also supposed to be able to help you transfer force from your legs through your core and into your shoulder to propel your boat. So by having a rudder, by having feet that can move easily, you're robbing a little bit of potential power out of your stroke by having that. There's a couple of companies that are making rudders now that are two-part. Where they steer, you have your foot peg that your foot's resting on, and then above the foot peg, you have a little toe rudder, and you use your toes to steer the rudder instead of your whole foot. So there are not too many manufacturers with that, but there are some that are going that way so that you reduce some of the inefficiency in the design. Recreational kayaks probably have one of the biggest ranges of quality and features and size. Recreational kayaks start all the way down at 6 feet long for kids. You know, they're rated to 115 pounds. They have a molded seat in them. They don't have their own seat, and they're basically little beginner models. They're not good for high wind or high wave situations. They're good for ponds. But they are serving a purpose, getting people introduced to the sport. And then you start moving up, that Sun Dolphin that's there, that's regularly a $175 to $200 boat at Walmart or Lowe's or Home Depot. Um, you know, the crazy thing about them is, even though they're cheap and very popular, well, I should probably, because they are very popular, if you buy one of those and you outgrow it or get tired of it, you can sell it on Facebook or Craigslist for $25 less than you bought it, and someone will buy it if it's early summer. So it's not necessarily a bad investment short term if you're trying to get someone into kayaking. They are not a quick boat. They tend to lose speed very quickly. But I know a few people that love them. They know the limitations of that particular boat, and they're fine with it. You start moving up, in the range to, the 9 to 12 footers, and you find a big variety of quality. That top boat, that Old Town Durgo, that's a roto molded boat. That's a high quality plastic boat. And I think that one does have a rear bulkhead to it for that hatch. That bottom boat, that Dagger, if that had a hatch in the back, that'd be a boat like Craig was talking about that looks like it should have a bulkhead, but it in fact doesn't. And that boat down there does not have a rear bulkhead at all. These boats also tend to have bigger cockpits. They're easier to enter and exit. And like we talked about before, you're going to get a little bit more wet in these boats generally. And you are going to want sunblock for your legs for sure, because your thighs will get sunburnt in those very easily. A good category for beginners. They do fine on the Maumee River in sort of the normal summer water conditions. The Maumee's nothing too technical or scary when it's at its normal flow for June, July, and August. I would hesitate to take these out into Lake Erie unless I really knew what the weather forecast was and checked on it, periodically. These are boats that if you get swamped, they're going to be very hard to rescue and get dried out. So anytime you're going on Lake Erie, it's constant checking of the weather because it can change at the drop of a hat too. So I'd be a little leery of taking these out onto big water. It's around Northwest Ohio. This type of boat on big water is where you see people get into trouble and people end up on the news. So, Craig?
Yeah, I'll just concur with you. These are perfectly fine boats. They float. You can paddle them, and they will go where you want them to go. But they have their limitations. If it's not a great summer day out, then there needs to be a lot more caution.
Yeah. Sit on top kayaks. These used to be the livery boat of choice on the Maumee River. Pretty much you can't drown in this boat, because if your boat flips over, you're going to fall out of it and you're no longer attached to your boat. So they're almost drown proof from the point of view that you can't get trapped in them. They come in a huge variety. This is a category that is rapidly expanding in as far as design and any kind of design criteria, length, width, weight, capability. This is a category that's just going crazy right now. They have really good primary stability. These are good nature photography kayaks. They're good fishing kayaks. They're good hunting kayaks. They are slower kayaks in general. You're not going to glide as far. You'll lose speed a little faster than the other two categories of boats. But they also fill a niche. They fill a niche in the market, which is generally what we see with a lot of outdoor products. Some manufacturer will find something that's not being satisfied, and there's a demand for it, and they will fill that demand. There are some very well-built, well-manufactured sit-on-top kayaks. The Eddy line up top and that Perception Tribe there in the middle are both very nice boats. And that Tribe is actually one of the models that was used by River Lures kayak livery in Grand Rapids for a bunch of years, and people loved them. So big thing with sit-on-top kayaks, there's a lot less handholds on them, especially looking at that Tribe. As far as to re-enter these in deep water, these are some of the most challenging boats to re-enter. Very difficult if you fall out to get back into them. So just be aware of that. And then this is going to be a very short slide. There's a lot of text here because neither Craig nor I are whitewater kayakers, as far as I know with Craig. Whitewater boats in Northwest Ohio sort of generally fall into these three categories: the river running, the creeking, and the play boating. I probably see more play boaters than anything. They find an area of the river that has whitewater, and they go out in this little play boat, which is the bottom blue boat that you see there, and they just stay in one place. They stay in one or two water features in the river, and they play in them. They do tricks in them. It's fun to watch. It's exciting. To do this kind of boating, you need to have a roll. You need to be able to right yourself without leaving the boat, because you're in rapids. And if you can't right yourself, you're going to be smacking your head on rocks as you get thrown downriver. And once you get out of your boat, you're still going to be bouncing off rocks until you leave the rapids. So it's preferred that you have a roll and right yourself and keep your head from getting smashed by things. So if you get into whitewater kayaking, I believe it is a Northwest Ohio River Gang is the
Toledo River Gang.
Dang it, Toledo River Gang.
Northwest Ohio River Runners is
Thank you, Craig.
distance guys.
Yes. So Toledo River Gang is a big whitewater club in Northwest Ohio, and they are always willing to teach and get people into this particular part of the sport.
And they have group gear and boats too. So if you want to get into whitewater stuff, you can always contact them, and they have loaner stuff they'll help teach you in.
Yeah. So that finishes up on the kayaks, and we are just about out of time. If you have to go, you're welcome to always leave the meeting. We are going to go through these slides pretty quick and talk a little bit about gear. And
My section is very short.
it's very short, but you know, we could sit here talking about gear for another hour.
Yeah, that's true.
We won't, because I know I have to get my kids to bed. But when you get into the sport, just know that whatever you're planning on spending on your boat, you're going to be spending a big chunk of money on gear as well. If you want to have a good experience and a safe experience. At the minimum, you're going to be getting a paddle and a life jacket. You're going to be registering your boat, which in Ohio, I think is $25 for a 3-year tag. Um, you know, life jackets are anywhere from, you know, the bare minimum $15 jacket that you would hate wearing, the old orange rectangles, you know, upwards of $350 for a rescue life jacket, you know, where you can go out and have all the tools on your vest to help rescue other people. Um, Paddles are the same way. You know, you got your basic aluminum and plastic paddle that might cost $25. You can get up into the carbon fiber and you know, special resin blades and different handle designs, and you know, spend $500 for a paddle. So yeah, it can get pricey pretty quick. And you know, just know that those 4 things listed at the bottom, those are your minimum requirements to get out and be legal. So if you have not seen this video, poor guy, he's actually paddling a very nice recreation kayak, manages to flip it in a marsh and then has no idea how to get back into his kayak. And I'm sure was play acting it up, calling for his friend Sarah. This is on YouTube. It's a funny video. Look it up, get a laugh. But essential gear wise, you know, we just talked about it, the boat, the propellant, and the propeller. Craig, what's the propellant?
There we go. I was muted. So essential gear is in quotes because essential is very personal, right? Essential gear for you might be totally different than essential gear for me. But there is foundational gear that applies to everybody, and that's obviously the boat, the propellant. So what are you going to use to propel yourself with? That would be the paddle, and the propeller. Obviously, that's you, hopefully. After that, essential is totally based upon your skill, your paddling venue, where you're going to be going, and then how long you're going to be out there, whether it's planned time or emergency time, perhaps if something goes wrong, or how long are you prepared to stay out there. So just to kind of go over that again, do you need the same things paddling on a pond as you do Lake Superior? Definitely not. For 3 days, if you're going on a trip versus an afternoon, obviously not again. Do you need the same things paddling if you're a seasoned kayak instructor as you do if it's your first time? Now that one can kind of be, do you need the same stuff? Do you? Do you need more rescue stuff? Or do you need more rescue options if it's your first time as you do if you're a seasoned kayak instructor and you know that these 1 or 2 things works every time? Sometimes you can get away with having more skill and less gear, but that's something to be discovered and not to assume.
Right. So we made mention of the life jackets. I would say one thing to look for, life jackets come in different types, as designated by the Coast Guard, basically types 1 through 5. Generally what people are going to be paddling with is going to be a type 3. It's a special use or a dedicated use life jacket. In the case of what we're seeing here on the screen, these are paddling life jackets. And they're designed for canoers and kayakers and stand-up paddle boards. Basically, they do not inhibit arm movement whatsoever. And if you look at the red jacket on the right side of it, the back side, you can see that the flotation on the back is up high, and down below is a mesh back. And that's to accommodate a seat back. You know, basically your back can be resting against the seat back without the life jacket in the way. And that can allow you to have a little bit more support and better form in your paddling. So these life jackets, you can start finding them in this design and shape and capability, around $50 at paddling shops or Bass Pro on upwards. These are the same style that can get up to $350, $400. Um, a good price for some pockets and places to store things and decent quality that's going to last for a few years if it's treated right. It's around $80 to $150. So it's a good investment, because if you are kayaking safely, you're wearing this the entire time. You want it to be as comfortable as possible. What's more important, having saving money and having a life jacket that you won't wear but you'll stick in the front of your boat, or spending more money and wearing something that could potentially save your life since you're actually wearing it. I always put a fair amount of money towards a comfortable life jacket is a good way to go, a safe way to go. And then paddles. And I will say paddles can be almost as confusing or challenging as kayaks.
That's so true.
It's so true. Anytime, even I've bought myself 2 paddles now. And that was after using 3 different types of paddles in my job. And it still involved, probably more hours of research than it needed to. But, the bottom right are some of your common building materials. The most inexpensive is at the bottom, the most expensive is at the top. That carbon shaft. It's a newer technology. It's very nice. It's very lightweight, very strong. The fiberglass is time-tested technology, and it's a great choice. It's a great step up. The biggest thing with aluminum shaft paddles is that aluminum draws the heat out of your hand. So if it's at all chilly, you're going to get cold hands eventually. So deciding on material, that's sort of the first budget consideration. That bottom paddle is probably $50. That top paddle is probably around 130, 150. And that's a very basic nylon blade carbon shaft. So that's sort of your first point, that's in your budget. And then up on the upper right, the shape of the blade relates to how you paddle your kayak. General purpose is a good middle of the road, doesn't do anything super well, doesn't do anything super bad. If you like to push your paddle from like chest high, you're a low angle paddler. Your arms are down in front of your chest. You take a little bit longer strokes and a little bit slower stroke, but you get to where you're going. The high angle blade is for paddlers that are pushing from their shoulder. It's usually a pretty aggressive, powerful stroke, but it's a shorter stroke. So you're doing more strokes per minute or per hour. It's personal preference, and sometimes it relates to your own fitness or, how healthy your shoulder joints are. People with shoulder problems really struggle with high angle blades because they get a lot of shoulder pain in them. Low angle blades, there's nothing wrong with them, but where it comes into play is you can see the colored area, the orange, is much longer than the blue. And when you go to buy a paddle, you buy it based on paddle length, which is the chart that's right below the words. Another situation where the chart is misleading or faulty, all of the lengths in this chart are for low angle paddlers. They generally have a longer paddle that they need to make their stroke work correctly. I can tell you, like I said, I'm 6 feet tall and I paddle a boat that's 25 inches in width. I do not use a 230 centimeter paddle. I use a 215 centimeter paddle. If I used a 230, I would not enjoy paddling with my current stroke. I would have to change it to a low angle stroke. So this is another one where some research needs to go into it. Talk to somebody who knows the 2 different paddling types, low angle versus high angle. or find a chart that actually breaks it out. Paddle length can also be measured from your sitting height, basically measuring from your tailbone to your shoulder while you sit down and you're sitting straight up and down. That's another way to find what length you should have. And then when you look at shafts, the most common is straight shaft. It's the least expensive. The neutral bent shaft is supposed to provide a little relief to your wrists when you paddle. So if you have carpal tunnel or you have wrist issues, a neutral bent shaft might be the way to go. But again, it's more expensive.
It is pretty amazing, the bent shafts,
Yes.
having used them before. And
They're
another big thing to consider with the materials is the weight.
Oh,
The
yeah.
paddle is what's connecting your body to the water, other than you sitting in the boat. So if you're paddling, you're going to do, maybe 500, 1,000 strokes in a trip, depending on what you're doing. So a lot of people will cough up the money for a good paddle, because the weight may change 6 ounces, 8 ounces, 12 ounces. But that can go a long way if you're doing it hundreds and hundreds of times.
Yeah. And it affects your shoulder too. The lighter the paddle, the less strain on your shoulder and your wrist. So I have 2 blades. One is fiberglass, one is a nylon blade. They're within 5 centimeters of each other. One weighs, I think, 34 ounces and the other one weighs 29. And when you paddle with the two, it's noticeably different, just at 5 ounces. So, and then the lower left, I don't know much about them, but the traditional northern hemisphere, native people paddles, you have the Greenlandic and the Aleutian style. Those are traditionally made out of wood. Now they're making them out of carbon fiber or fiberglass. They are a lot narrower and they are longer, and they call for a different stroke and different stroke cadence. People do try these out, and they're less strain for certain shoulder muscle groups, and people end up loving them. I'm not converted yet. I still paddle the European style, which is generally what you see a lot of times in Northwest Ohio. Craig, has Sean converted you?
I would buy one if I had the money, but yeah, they're definitely a different breed of paddle. The surface area is spread out throughout the whole shaft of the paddle. So rather it being condensed to the blade, big flat blade, the whole paddle is essentially a blade. So it changes the stress.
Yeah.
It is typically a little bit easier on your shoulders and on your elbows and stuff. So if you know that these are already things that bother you, regardless of any strength training that you can do, try out a native paddle, a Greenland or a Aleutian, and you may be surprised.
This slide is all you, Craig.
I love this chart. Okay, so this pretty much is
chart.
This chart pretty much is just to get your critical thinking going. It goes back to the whole what gear is really essential. And it has to do with venue risk over to the left. So what risks are inherent with the environment you're going to be paddling in? Just for your reference, let's say that a pond in your backyard is all the way at the bottom on a calm day with no wind. And then all the way at the top is like class XXXXX 57 million rapids or something. Down at the bottom, our x-axis is your preparedness. And that is a sum of the skill that you have learned and the gear that you have. However, at the bottom, I love this little quote: gear without knowledge of how to use it is just weight. So if you buy all sorts of gear and it's really cool and, oh, it's supposed to let me do this or that, but you don't know how to use it and you don't actually have practice using it, then it is just weight in your boat. So then we have this bluish line. that is what I like to call the challenge line. So that is the maximum threshold of preparedness and venue risk coming together that should be a challenging but exciting experience. Now, anywhere under that, so let's say that you have a ton of preparedness, but your venue risk is very low. If we're all the way at the bottom, well, we're pretty bored. If our skill is way higher than what this venue is providing us, is challenging us, it's going to be bored. It's going to be boring. It's going to be terrible. The further up you get towards that challenge line, you're comfortable, yet you're engaged. There's some challenging things about the venue, but you're prepared. You have to call upon some of your skill and possibly some of your gear to tackle that venue. Once you start getting to the line, well, that's where it really starts to get up to you as far as, is this really exciting? This is pretty risky, but do I have the capability to handle it if an emergency were to arise in this venue? If your preparedness is below the amount of risk that is in the venue, well, we go all the way to the top left. You're just asking for danger. You're asking for no good. Hopefully skull and crossbones isn't in your future, but that is a real possibility. So it's just something to think about. Is the venue that I'm going to kayak in, do I have the preparedness required to tackle any possible emergency that could arise, or environmental challenge that it's going to throw at me? Just starting to critically think about that. Now
So,
these two, oh, go ahead.
Go nuts.
Okay. Well, these two lists, these two pictures are funny. Both of them came up when I searched essential kayaking equipment. Obviously, these are two different opinions. If you look all the way to the left, we've got dye markers and flare guns and EP IRB. That's essentially an emergency device that if you use it, it sends out a radio signal that directly contacts first responders, and it gives them a GPS location for you. Very expensive, but a lot of people won't go out without it. GPSs and strobes and all this sort of stuff. And then you go over to the right, and that list is a lot smaller. You've got a PFD, you've got clothes, you've got probably what looks like a neoprene shirt in the middle folded up, gloves, neoprene socks, paddle, a bilge pump down at the bottom, that NRS thing upside down, a water bottle, and a dry bag. Again, essential is totally up to you. Just think about your environment. Think about what things you might encounter, who's coming with you, what's your ability. And then again, what things do you think that you may need to bring that you know how to use to help counteract and reduce the risk of some of those challenges that you might encounter? I won't actually dive into the gear because, again, we could be all day here, and some of them are self-explanatory, but we go down into some stuff later. So these are just like basic stuff, along with some of those critical thinking questions that may drive you towards seeking out knowledge, seeking out some classes, or seeking out other pieces of gear to help satiate things that might come up for you. So I like to break things down into 4 different categories. Gear and knowledge to use that gear for safety, clothing to wear, logistics, and then personal stuff. So starting with safety, obviously that's your PFD, some way to signal. Now this could be a strobe, this could be a flare, communication, that's a VHF radio, that's a special marine use radio. first aid kit, self-rescue gear, stuff like that. And the way that we get to these pieces of gear are, who will I possibly encounter while I'm out there? That's where communication, signaling comes into play. For boats, if you're going out into water where there's powerboat traffic, they have VHF radios on their boats. And there are ways that you can contact them with your VHF radio. What are their needs? So if you have somebody coming with you that maybe has a medical condition, or maybe they have diabetes or something like that, is there something that you can bring to help with their needs? And what if I have an emergency? Think about those emergencies that might come about. Do you have the equipment and knowledge to be able to handle them? Moving on, clothing. Definitely, we're going to preach synthetics. So no natural materials like cotton or jeans, just because they're going to sap your heat. And we're trying to avoid hypothermia. And then think about your warmth. So what is the forecast coming up? So is it going to rain? Do you need a rain jacket? Is it going to thunderstorm? That could also go into your logistics as far as how long you can be out. What is the water temperature? We always plan for water immersion. A lot of times people get in trouble in late April or early May when it's like a 75, 80 degree day, but the water has not had time to reach above, 62 or 3 or 4 or something like that. And you're going to get hypothermia in that water very quickly. In fact, if that water is around 64 or 5 degrees, you may lose muscle function and drown before you ever get hypothermia. So always be prepared for water immersion. Unfortunately, that means you probably need to paddle in the clothes for water immersion. It does you no good to bring clothes along with you, like neoprene or anything like that that's designed for keeping you warm in the water. It does you no good to have that stuff packed away when you dump. So unfortunately, whether it's a little too hot or something like that, unfortunately, you probably got to wear that stuff. Logistics. Your means for navigation. So whether that is a map and a compass to orient yourself to that map. If you know exactly where you're going, perfectly fine if you have it memorized. But then your communication. Do you have the means to call somebody or pull up a map in a pinch if you know that you're going to be in cell service the whole time? If you're not going to be in cell service, obviously that takes the phone out of commission. Make sure to bring that map. So critical thinking questions for what to bring logistically. Where am I going and how do I reference myself to where I'm going? If you're thinking of something, now imagine that you lost that piece of gear. Now what are you going to use? Knowing where you're going is probably top dog once you're out there on the river. It can look a whole lot different than from the roadside. A really important one, who knows I'm here? A lot of times we'll unfortunately see on the news, somebody will go out fishing on their kayak, doesn't tell anybody they're out there, they're by themselves. Something happens, whether they fall down and bonk their head or become unconscious in some way, and search and rescue has to go get them 4 days later, a week later, something like that. It's really important to, no matter where you're going, even if you're going out on the pond for a little bit in your neighbor's house, you need to tell somebody else who's not going with you. We like to call that a float plan. So a float plan can be as official as you want, or it can be as nonchalant as me texting Bill, hey Bill, I'm gonna be out on the Maumee River. I should be back by lunchtime. If I don't respond by this time, send somebody out for me or tell my family or whatever. Somebody always needs to know that you're out there, and they shouldn't be somebody you're with. If you and the buddy you're with are the only ones that know that you're out there and something happens to both of you, well, now you're both screwed. along with that, having a phone with you, when you're done, who's coming to get you? Obviously, you need a way to communicate. If your phone's not waterproof, this is where we start getting into this critical thinking thing. What if your phone's not waterproof? Well, you got to bring a little dry box or something like that for it. And the last one is personal. Now, this is your personal medical needs, food, water, a crap kit, which is, you know, what if duty calls? You need to be able to get out somewhere, right? So how are you going to handle that situation? So how will I maintain my energy and my health? If you're planning on being out there just for an afternoon, snack bar, great. However, is the venue that you're going to paddle on, are you familiar with it? Is there a possibility of you getting lost? Do you know your pull-out points? Are you going to need more food or water? Always good things to think about. So not diving into specific gear too much because it's so niche, but these critical thinking questions are going to get you to the things that you need. Anything to add, Bill?
No, I'd say, you know, if we, of course, it won't let me go backwards. All that gear that was on the previous slide, you know, we could recommend it, but without the knowledge of how to use some of it, it becomes just weight, like Craig said with the graph. So, you know, the minimum he spells out pretty well here, and he's getting you thinking. You know, I would add, take more water than you think you need. That's always sort of the thing that runs out first, or that you're going to need the soonest. You know, dehydration acts on you much quicker than hunger does. So I always take more water than I need. I generally take a little bit more food than I need. I don't go crazy on that for, you know, just short paddles, but definitely I'd rather pour out a bunch of water when I get back on land than to be super thirsty and grouchy and getting a headache before I get back. So water is a big one. Like, oh, now it went backwards. That's weird. Yeah, I think we'll leave it at that.
So really at the end of the day, when you see some of these long-term kayakers going out and they're all geared up and everything, do you have to be these guys? No, absolutely not. Every time you go out, I'm actually guilty of this. I'm trying to get better. I do not need to pack every single thing I own into my kayak if I'm just going out for an evening paddle around Ewing Island. I have the skill and the knowledge and minimal gear to be able to have an enjoyable paddle doing that. Now, these are things that you can whittle down. It's good to have stuff, but you don't want to whittle down so far that you become this guy. No life jacket. I don't even know what kind of paddle that is. It's like a spoon. Inflatable kayak and the booze, okay? Do not mix your alcohol and your paddling.
Definitely not.
Or else you'll end up drinking something that you were floating on.
So we're done with what we want to get through. Like I said, at around 8 o'clock, you're welcome to take off now. If you have any questions, there is a chat feature, both typing, or you can reactivate your microphone. If for some reason you can't reactivate your microphone, let me know in the chat and I will activate it. But Craig and I would be happy to take any questions if you have any.
Do you guys have, this is Christy speaking, obviously. Do you guys have kayaks that that you rent? Or
so we don't have rentable kayaks, but we do have multiple programs for a really nominal fee throughout the year, or throughout the summer mostly anyway. And then every Monday between Memorial Day and Labor Day, out at WW Night Nature Preserve in Perrysburg, every Monday from 4 to 7:30, we have Paddle the Pond. And on the last Monday of every month, so 3 times, we bring out the kayaks that you can try out different types and all the ones that we have. So if that was too much, it was. I'll write it in the chat over here. But it's June, July, and August. The last Monday of the month is kayaks at Paddle the Pond, WW Night from 4 to 7:30.